Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Dave Teitelbaum, and I'm a partner at Sidley Austin in Washington, D.C., in the banking financial services practice. I've been doing payments work for, getting close to 30 years now, so not long after I was sitting in one of those chairs out there. So I'll let the rest of the panel introduce themselves, and then we'll get it kicked off.
I'm Iran Kahana from the Maslin firm in Minneapolis and also a research fellow here at Codex, which is the Center for Computational Law.
I'm John Muller, Vice President for Payments Policy at PayPal. So currently not in a legal role, but until recently was the General Counsel at PayPal.
I'm Holly Toll, partner in Seattle, Washington with K&L Gates.
Okay. So before I get kicked off, also been asked to remind you that this year the evaluations are all going to be done online. So after the session, if you'd be good enough to fill out the online evaluations of the panel, we'd really appreciate it, and Stanford really appreciate it. So this panel, as advertised, is going to talk about two very interesting topics, mobile payments and virtual currency. Those are topics that you could each spend a day on, but we're going to cover everything in 1 hour. To start off, what we're going to do, I think, is first spend some time talking about mobile payments, and then turn it over to virtual currency in the second part of the presentation. As we go through, if people have questions, please go ahead and ask. We want to make this as interesting and dynamic as possible. And speaking of dynamic, this is kind of one of the really interesting and dynamic areas of financial services and e-commerce to me. Just to throw out a couple of numbers, just pulled off of TechCrunch. In 2013, there were almost $5 trillion of just card payments. Okay? Just card payments. That's ignoring ACH, wire. Intra-institutional payments, $5 trillion. In the first quarter of 2014, there were 59 startups that raised almost $500 million in venture funding in the payment space. That does not include M&A activity or other kind of investments that have been made internally by companies and institutions. So we're talking about a space where there's a tremendous amount of activity, a tremendous amount of investment. And again, two of the most significant drivers of that are mobile technology and virtual currency. In this space, it's not just the technology that's dynamic, it's the regulation that's dynamic. As we kick off the discussion of mobile, we're going to, I think, get into some things that, developments in this area from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which recently announced an inquiry into mobile financial services. They purport not to be investigating mobile point-of-sale purchase, but it's a pretty broad inquiry. They also are due to announce a prepaid proposal by the end of the summer. We've had enforcement actions on state licensing issues for folks in the mobile payment space. So it's a really kind of active and dynamic area from a regulatory perspective as well as a technology perspective. But in order to talk about it at all, we really have to kind of ground ourselves in what are we talking about when we're talking about mobile payments, because it means different things to different people, and there are so many different players. So I'd like to turn over to Holly for a moment to talk about that a little bit and ground us in what the ecosystem is, the roles of different players, and the features and functionality that kind of create the challenges here.
Great, thank you. So when we had a pre-meeting, I said, I can do a slide that'll just make it all crystal clear. And when I got done, I said, well, maybe not. But still, if you start in the lower right-hand corner, we're talking mobile payments. And essentially, the goal is to take your wallet, which is full of actual cash and credit cards and debit cards and prepaid cards, gift cards, and loyalty cards. That would be like, every time you get your car washed, you get one, you build up points to get a free wash, or you go to the bakery and every time you buy a loaf of bread, you get points for getting a loaf of bread. So that's what they mean by loyalty programs. And we'll be talking about virtual currency. So maybe there aren't really greenbacks in the wallet, but there's something else that is accepted as currency. So the sort of holy grail here is to take that whole wallet and replace it with something digital. And so then the question is, okay, what's the mobile part? And that is, right now, it's the cellular phone, the smartphone, but it could be a tablet. It's, it's going to evolve. But so that's the second part of the slide is, okay, so let's start with smartphones. If you mobilize all that, then who are you dealing with? So so these are some of the players. Biggest player in the last decade has been the handset manufacturer and the MNO, the mobile network operator. And the theory was that you needed a secure element, some kind of chip that would sit in the handset to make all of this secure enough. And so that's kind of what the assumption has been. Only in the last, 6 months or so, it seems like, has this conversation shifted to saying, oh, gee, no, we don't need a secure element in the handset at all. It can be in the cloud. So now go up and you see the cloud up there. And now the debate will shift to, well, is that secure enough? Is the cloud always available? What's going to come down from the cloud? Is it the whole card number? Is it a token? But so the debate is going to shift. But for a long time, the handset manufacturers and the mobile networks, there was a lot of pushing and shoving over who was going to own the secure element and who had access to it and that kind of thing. But that is now a different debate. Okay, then who else is a player? The software developers. And I've got software apps up there, but also the operating system. And the thing with mobile devices is nobody made them with payments in mind, or at least traditionally they don't. So these are operating systems that will work for a ton of things. So the app itself, you've probably heard of the payment card industry standard, and the most famous one is PCI DSS. So it's payment card industry standard, data security standard, but there's a ton of other standards. And one of them is the PA DSS, which is the payment application digital security standard, or data security standard. And so if you're purporting to allow mobile payments on the device and you're not a certified PA, payment application, then you're not going to go anywhere because no merchant can take the device. So looking at what devices merchants can take, look at the last bullet there. Right now, and I can't remember now if this is a PCI document I was reading or a MasterCard document, but there's guidance out now on, has been for a while, on what standards handsets have to meet. And there's basically 3 categories. And category 1 assumes that the device is totally dedicated to payments, and that's not going to happen very often. Category 2 is it's not totally dedicated to payments, but it's going to have enough security and meet enough standards that it's okay to take payments on it. Category 3 is forget it. So if you're falling into category 3, then the merchant who allows that to come into the store and process payments is going to be in trouble. And that's kind of a theme of what I'm going to talk about, and that is if you don't build something that the merchants can take, or if the merchants get in trouble because of the way you built it, even if you get a sizable group of merchants to take it, they're going to abandon it because they're going to get hit with lawsuits and fines. And so that's kind of the missing piece here. If you actually, as a practicing attorney, and I help both financial institutions and merchants, but I'm constantly amazed when I look at it from the merchant's perspective. You can't tell what's going on, and once you figure out what's going on by talking to the developers and the person offering it, they haven't heard of half the laws that they need to comply with. So that leaves your client, the merchant, just being a sitting duck. So that's where I see the biggest problem is. Okay, so now move to the other side and you see the consumer. If you can't get the consumer who's willing to take these devices and to get rid of the wallet and use the device instead, then you're not anywhere. Because merchants clearly want consumers, and everybody above the merchants wants the merchants. So this side, the merchant and the consumer, those are the 2 most valuable prizes for people in this space to charm, in a sense. You want to charm the consumers and you want to charm the merchants. At that Consumer level, again, probably the biggest sore spot I see is the lack of compliance with consumer protection laws. When you actually look at the laws that apply and look at the compliance, you won't see much connection. And part of that is because the regulators have been standing back. They've been standing on the sidelines, kind of waiting for this space to develop, and they didn't want to get in the way of innovation. But as it develops and as people start to emerge as winners, that's when they're going to come in. And David already talked about the CFPB saying we're going to start taking a look. Privacy and big data, they're big issues in this space because whatever the device is, the assumption is that it's going to gather lots of data, and just as in everything else you've seen so far today, privacy and big data, everybody believes there's value there. So even if you can't make money on the payment side of it, maybe you make money on the data side of it, but that throws you squarely into more compliance. Okay, so now go up to the merchant. I'm old enough to remember when merchants shifted from checks to credit cards. And I grew up in a small town, and our pharmacist had this big sign in his window, and it basically said, "Don't get a credit card." And I thought, wow. You know, I mean, I didn't know what a credit card was, but I thought it was a little weird that he was so adamant against it. And, you know, all these decades later, I kind of now begin to understand what he was talking about. Because his real, you know, what happened was the merchants were taking checks and they were getting counterfeit checks. So they were losing money. So the Visa and MasterCard came in and said, we can solve that for you. Take the credit card. Debit cards didn't exist then. Take the credit card. We, Visa and MasterCard, we will take the risk of counterfeit checks, counterfeit cards, and imposters having that card. And that was the value proposition. That was it. And the internet didn't exist, so it was this face-to-face card present. So even to today, until 2015, when it's all going to shift, even to this very day, merchants do not have the risk of counterfeit cards or imposters. If you and I are standing face-to-face across the counter, that's the big deal for merchants. They don't have that risk. 2015, boom, that's gone. Unless merchants convert to near-field communication, switch all their terminals out, there's going to be a liability risk shift, is how Visa and MasterCard talk about it. And unless their terminals will work with NFC and EMV, which is chip and pin or chip and signature, both for point of sale, you know, physical, and contactless, then merchants will bear all the risk. So when you look back at the old proposition that the big thing the merchants were going to get out of it was this lack of problems with the counterfeit, now they're facing having all the burdens. And so to my eye, this means that everything's in upheaval because merchants have to now decide, is this the current state of the credit card, debit card system? Does it bring enough value to us to make this change out? Now, of course, if half the world is using MasterCard and Visa and the other credit cards, there's not much choice. But that's why if you look up at the top at the new players, there's so many new people coming in saying, we got an idea. And so you can see that it all is kind of up in the air. It's kind of like a ball, a lot of balls up in the air being juggled. Merchants also don't have the same attitude they had before. The antitrust suits against Visa, MasterCard, some of the larger card organizations, where they're talking about, you know, the discount fees, and they've won some of those suits. And in this whole marketplace, merchants have even started their own organization called MCX, and their concept is they will use QR codes that will work with the terminals they already have, and they'll keep their own data. They already have data on their consumers. They'll keep the data. So you can see there's all these people with different views, and everybody's grasping for trying to, you know, come out the winner. Go up to the upper left, and that's supposed to symbolize all the new players. So to talk about some of those, you've got Square, which their business model, I'll flip to another slide in a second to show you their business model. Up until a few years ago, that business model would have violated Visa and MasterCard rules. But they changed the rules, so now that's a business model that didn't exist. So if you're have this cognitive dissonance about why is all this happening, that's part of it. So Square, what it brings to the table is a whole bunch of new merchants called sub-merchants now, because no one used to underwrite those merchants. You know, the merchants at the art fair, they were too little for anybody to underwrite. Square now underwrites them. Square becomes the merchant of record that Visa and MasterCard and the banks look to. Apple, it's got an army of consumers. It hasn't chosen yet. It hasn't said whether it's going to put in its handset NFC or what it's going to do. But it's got a bunch of registered users with iTunes accounts. So, you know, that's a player too, but nobody knows which way it's going to jump. So the little guy with the spear is just supposed to indicate, you know, free for all. Everybody's just jockeying around. You get to the cloud, and the question there is HCE, host card emulation, what used to be done in the handset or what people thought would be done there. Now maybe it'll be done in the cloud. And so people have to figure out how can you do that that'll make it work securely. Then you get to the banks, and again, you see a lot of jockeying there because it used to be Visa and MasterCard were owned by the banks. That's not true anymore. So you have different kinds of banks. You have to be a member of Visa or MasterCard to be part of the processing community. So there's a member bank. You can acquire, meaning you're buying what used to be the paper credit card slips. You're buying those from the merchants at a discount. That's where the discount comes in. So you're an acquiring institution. Or you're issuing cards. Or you're doing all of them. But if you're not doing them all of them, you have different interests. And then the credit unions, they're not members, so they're kind of ticked off because they're issuers, and they don't feel that they're getting, you know, the right kind of risk allocation in the data security wars. So then you get to the payment system itself. Something like an ACH transfer, you know, when your paycheck gets credited to your bank account, that's a private kind of system, but it's really kind of quasi-governmental. But so there's the kind of governmental or quasi-governmental systems, and then there's the Visa, MasterCard, and Amex, the card organization systems, and they're all by contract, flowing all the way down the chain, contracts, contracts, contracts. And then you get to another holy grail, the IP for all this. You know, whatever method, whatever patent, whatever it comes out of this, somebody wants to be the owner of that. So just real quickly, I'm going to switch to one more slide to show you. Okay, this slide shows you that this is a MasterCard slide, and it shows you the traditional structure until a couple years ago. So that's the traditional structure. MasterCard, Visa were at the top. There was an acquiring institution, that's the merchant bank, and then there was a merchant. Direct contractual line down. Merchant, at the end of the day, would have all these paper slips, walk across the street, hand them to the bank would buy them, and then give the money to the merchant. That's the traditional view, and it used to be, until a few years ago, that you were laundering if you were doing something else. Now what's happening is you have somebody called a payment facilitator, that's where Square is, and Visa calls it payment service provider. So what's happening there is now Square is kind of viewed as the merchant of record, and that's the company that's underwritten by everybody above it. And then Square lines up all of what they call sub-merchants, and now that puts Square in the position of being liable for all the fraud that can occur at the sub-merchant level. So what I've seen is sometimes you will see companies that are in the position of Square but don't know it, and that's a very risky legal position to be in. So with that, I'm going to go back to the first slide.
Hey, thanks, Holly.
Yeah.
That's a good kind of summary of the ecosystem. I think for folks who may not be as familiar with the way the card associations set the rules for payment transactions that involve their cards. When Holly talks about PCI and EMV, and the payment facilitator model, those are all constructs of the card association rules. That's when you have a central facility that is actually thinking about payments and payment security and saying, in order to protect the entire infrastructure, we need to set some rules, and that's where those rules come from. So Ron, I guess I'd like to kind of turn to you and say, okay, so there's, we've got a whole bunch of different players there, but what are some of the bigger legal issues that you're seeing for, the different players in this space?
Sure. Before I begin, I'd like to ask a question here of all of you. How many people here are more likely to notice that they forgot their mobile phone versus their wallet? Okay, so the studies suggest the same. So when I first got introduced to this whole idea of mobile payments, I said, why would anybody even do this? And the first interesting tidbit that sold me on it was the fact that exactly what everybody here is saying. We are more likely to notice that we've forgotten our mobile phone than we are our wallet, which then rolls into other areas of we are more likely to start using our mobile phones or slash smartphones for conducting various types of financial transactions, and that's where I started back in around 2005 dealing with this area of mobile payments at a company I worked for at the time called DataCart. So there's three themes that I think are really at the center stage of this whole mobile phone, mobile payment industry, and that's data security, privacy, and how disputes are managed. So before we begin on on those central themes, it's important to realize that there's just an enormous population out there of people who are basically on the verge of using mobile payments in just an enormous volume. So according to the Federal Reserve, 87% of the population in the United States have mobile phones. 44% of that are smartphones. So right there you can get a sense of what you're dealing with in terms of scope. So it's a very large population segment of people who are ready to use this, and what are we getting in ourselves into? These are the three themes that I want to talk about: data security, privacy, and managing disputes. So on the data security part, again, these are studies that are conducted by the FTC and the Federal Reserve. The study shows that consumers are very interested in using mobile payments, but are very leery of the risks associated with that. So it's unclear, first of all, as somebody who examines these things, not just from a legal perspective, but also maybe on an academic and philosophical perspective, the question is whether or not the risk that we're dealing with here is any larger than the risks that we are already dealing with in other areas of our daily financial transactions. So for example, if I'm using a credit card, am I really exposing myself to more risk or less risk if I were to use mobile payments? That's I'm not suggesting that an answer here, it's a question for you to consider. In terms of data security, when people are polled what are they mostly concerned about, this perception of this mobile device sending out data, so people are concerned about hacking. So they're concerned about somebody sitting right next to them and siphoning off their information from their device. So that, whether that is true or not, I have not been aware of any such instances, but that is a significant concern that people are talking about. So we talk about, Holly mentioned NFC and RFID as some of the big platforms that people are putting out there in terms of how we communicate with the point of sale terminals. But then you also mentioned QR codes or 2D barcodes, which are another element that satisfy the fact that they cannot be ripped off. It's almost impossible to rip off a 2D barcode or a QR code and take that data out from the hands of the consumer. So the data security aspect of that is relatively more secure than in an RFID or NFC setting. The privacy aspect is very complex, and I don't know that anybody has a very good grip on exactly all the things that should be done or can be done in the privacy aspects. But there's a number of questions that we can ask. First of all, what do I need to disclose in order to carry out a transaction? I don't know that we all know exactly what it is that we need to disclose. We may be told, for example, at a cash register, that we need to give the merchant our zip code. Well, how many people have ever been asked to disclose their zip code in a transaction? Raise of hands. Do you need to disclose that transaction? No, you do not. Why do we disclose it? pressure at the cash register, right? So the why do I need to disclose it? I asked the register person, I said, why do I need to disclose it? She had no clue. She's told to disclose it. How is my information used? So if I disclose my zip code to you, how are you going to use it? So the person you're asking has no idea. The person at the cash register has no idea. As a consumer, most consumers have no idea how it's going to be used. But we know, for our more savvy users, know that our zip code is going to be used for marketing purposes, right? They're going to figure out where they're getting consumers, which I'm not suggesting is necessarily a bad thing, but it really is going back to the question, do I need to disclose this in order to buy this? And this gets a little bit into the computational law aspects that I'm a big fan of. Obviously, I've been doing this for a while now here at Stanford, is do all merchants require me to disclose this? So if I'm coming to the register terminal, and again using the zip code example, and I want to carry out this transaction, do all merchants require this? So I have no information when I'm coming to this register. I don't know if all merchants require this, but I am being asked for that information, and as all of you disclosed here, you do provide it, very happily. So on the computational side, and we'll get into this when we talk about best practices, there's a solution for this type of quandary of helping relieve the consumer a little bit of the concerns they have over privacy by being able to better address these concerns around privacy. Now, the last thing I want to mention about privacy is if our information is hacked. How many people here shop at Target? Oh, come on, there's more of you. Fine. Everybody's information at some point got hacked. I know that I had to exchange at least one card in my household because of this. So it affected me, to some level. But how do I know if this happens? I only know if Target tells me it happened. Is there a better way to manage this? Is there a better way to inform the consumer? And the idea is that a more informed consumer is a happier consumer in the sense that they understand the risk of what they are undertaking.
Ron, can I ask on that issue, for example, we've got data breach statutes in almost every state, but we don't have a federal data breach statute, at least that covers other than financial institutions. Is that a gap that you see, or is that something that is better managed at the state level, the way it currently is today?
I think the answer is actually it's a gap, but I don't think neither of these make any difference. I think that the fact that there's a statute that requires notification, but when you dig down into the specifics, you find out that the merchants who experienced the breach have a lot of flexibility in how they can disclose that to you. So the question is, well, 2 years have gone by, and now I only learned that my information was exposed, and you're wondering, well, what does that mean? Target and other examples, you're not informed. I would think, from just my perspective, it's not in a timely manner. So if you had a federal notification standard, the question is whether or not, if the disclosure happens a year later, is that any good? Does it help? So the question really, from a best practices perspective, is there a way that we can notify consumers quicker about a breach that has nothing to do with the merchants? Merchants, once the transaction is done, the merchants lose the ability to manage whether or not they have the notification of the breach card anymore. Once you've done the transaction with them, they lose that. If there's a breach, you will be notified. The third theme is the managing disputes. And the big ticket item here is fraudulent charges, and really giving people the comfort level that if there is a fraudulent charge as a result of a mobile transaction, that it is going to be resolved quickly. One of the issues that drives the urgency here is the funding mechanisms that are used, and I don't know if, John, you can talk more about the funding mechanisms, but there's a variety of different funding mechanisms. One is tying it to a credit card or a debit card or to a mobile carrier. There's different ways of funding the mobile transaction. And the way you choose to fund it, if it's through a credit card, where you have the broadest protection, the highest level of protection, I should say. But if you have some other levels of funding mechanisms, those are giving you less protection. So the resolution of the dispute becomes a lot more of an urgent matter at that point. The other aspect is to ensure, again, remember that the theme here is to reduce the consumer's perception of risk that is associated with the transaction on a mobile level. So it's ensuring that consumers understand what they're getting themselves into when they are choosing, for example, to fund in any manner that is not a credit card. If you're choosing to fund, do you actually know what you're getting yourself into? And if you do presumably know, then presumably your level of risk that you're associating with the transaction has lowered. The problem that is today, because there is no federal standard on how you are going to manage these disputes and so forth, and what level of protections there are, aside from credit cards and to some level debit cards, the gaps are being filled today by companies who are making contractual-based promises to consumers on how they will deal with these fraudulent charges. And not necessarily fraudulent, but maybe even unauthorized. It doesn't necessarily have to rise to the level of being fraud. But, okay, so you have the best type of contractual promise. The question then, of course, is how do you communicate that to the consumer in a meaningful way? And we can spend a day just on talking about that. And then there is the level of how do you ensure that this level of promise doesn't reduce or change over time. So a year 2, year 3, year 4 in the relationship you have, that promise stays intact and doesn't suddenly disappear or doesn't change in a meaningful way that what you thought you had in year 1 now is gone. So the managing dispute aspect has to stay static and to a certain level in order to ensure that people have that level of certainty in terms of their transaction.
Thanks for that. I think just because we have so much to cover, I'd like to make kind of a sharp turn here and talk a little bit about virtual currency, and then we can toward the end come back. People have questions they have in particular about mobile payments. Virtual currency gets just a tremendous amount of attention in the press, particularly because of Bitcoin. But the concept of virtual currency is broader than Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is actually just one example of a particular category of cryptocurrency, which is a virtual currency that is based on a technology that is not centralized and is based on the mathematical algorithms that result in people assigning value to a piece of information and their willingness to trade on the basis of their belief that that bit of code will continue to hold that value over a period of time, or maybe increase in value as people sort of bet on that. But there are a lot of different types of virtual currency, and so John, maybe do you want to take a minute and try to talk about maybe some differences of different types of virtual currency that are not just Bitcoin?
Sure. So it's a little bit ironic maybe that I get to talk about virtual currency on the panel, since PayPal is one of the participants on the mobile payments side. But at this point, we don't, today at least, accept Bitcoin as a funding mechanism. So I have less practical experience with Bitcoin. But certainly it's a fascinating topic, and I think anyone who is professionally involved in payments is watching the developments closely of virtual currencies. And as David indicated, there is what makes Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, or sometimes called math-based currencies, interesting is this difference compared to virtual currencies we've seen previously of being decentralized and not having a single issuer that controls the virtual currency. So We've had examples like Second Life Virtual World issued its own currency, Linden dollars, still does. And other gaming companies, World of Warcraft, have internal systems. So that's not, it's certainly interesting, but not necessarily new. And of course, the challenge there in expanding those is that they are centralized. There is a single issuer which has its own motivations, and other merchants may get suspicious if they're asked to accept Linden dollars or Facebook credits, because at one point Facebook was running its own credit system. Amazon has Amazon coins. But if you're a merchant who is not Amazon and is in some ways competing with Amazon, you may be somewhat suspicious about accepting Amazon coins as a currency or a payment method. With cryptocurrencies, and of course Bitcoin is by far the best known now, you have a decentralized currency with no single issuer, and it is, they say, math-based in that you have an open source program code underlying it, which has certainly been reviewed by all the leading cryptographers and verified to work and working in practice every day. So it creates the potential of an alternative source of value and of payment. And you probably got a sense from the discussion on mobile payments that if you look at it certainly from a merchant perspective, but even from other types of high volume, high frequency payments like international remittances, for a long time there's been kind of the mantra of everyone is looking for payment methods that are, secure, fast, and cheap, and pick 2 out of 3. And now recently, really, with the advent of the internet and e-commerce, you have to add to secure, fast, and cheap. Is the payment method international, and is it programmable? Is it well adapted to the world of platforms and APIs? And Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies offer that nirvana, potentially, of a payment method that is certainly fast and, at least for the moment, low cost. The whole system, not to try to explain the whole system in a very short period of time, but the system relies on miners to verify transactions. And today, miners mostly accept compensation in the form of very low fee, plus the possibility of appreciation of the bitcoins that they earn as new Bitcoin, and earning new bitcoins as new bitcoins are created. At a certain point, supposedly well past our lifetimes, bitcoins will run out, and they will certainly over time become harder to get new bitcoins. And so there's still an open question of what kind of fee or how will miners be compensated over time. But for the moment, it's still certainly a very low-cost system, and it's very international. So the real question boils down to security, and it reveals really the way in which security has a lot of different meanings depending on which hat you're wearing at the moment. For many people, security they associate with, if I buy something and something goes wrong, do I have some sort of protection through the payment method? Which, if you look at the whole sweep of history, is somewhat unnatural, but in the US is now taken for granted, and in many other countries as well, that consumer protection is built into the payment method. Now, with Bitcoin today, consumer protection is not built into the payment method. So there are, several entrepreneurs who are busily looking at potential ways of trying to build consumer protection into the payment method and making a profit off it because it is a valuable service. But that's one issue today for wider adoption of Bitcoin. Another important factor that many people are thinking of when they use the term security is really privacy, and that's certainly a factor in favor of cryptocurrencies. Is the transaction itself doesn't carry information other than really the number of your address. Now, the transaction under that address, those numbers, that string of numbers and letters, is traceable, but there's no centralized database connecting that Bitcoin address to any particular person. You might reveal it yourself in some form, in some way, but there's no centralized way of getting at it. So that's what makes Bitcoin attractive as a potential payment method. Of course, we're still very, very early days, but that's why the excitement in the payment industry over what Bitcoin could be has certainly been growing over the last year plus. And then certainly important to mention, of course, that we're in a payments panel, but the technology that allows for basically confirmation that a certain file or a certain store of value has not been duplicated has a lot of applications outside of payments. You can see things like securities transfer, land titles. So that's another area where there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity taking place in applying the blockchain technology.
John, I'd like to take it back to the consumer protection concept that you mentioned, because the protections that the rest of the panel have talked about in terms of customer disputes derive mainly from federal law, also some state laws, Regulation E and Regulation Z at federal level. And one of the unique things about sort of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, because it is this decentralized technology, it raises questions as to licensing. It raises questions as to the application of laws like the Electronic Fund Transfer Act and Regulation E. And if those protections, the Regulation E protections against unauthorized use, for example, do not apply, and that's a big if. Another thing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is supposed to be doing by the end of this summer is coming out with its proposal on stored value regulation. And it was actually supposed to be out by now. And sort of one of the questions is going to be, are they going to try to expand traditional concept of stored value into sort of a Bitcoin type technology? Is it possible to even think about those kind of protections in that environment? And if not, okay, if it is not possible because of the very nature of the technology, which is a definitive transaction, once you transfer that coin, the ownership of the coin has moved to somebody else. The code securing that coin is no longer yours, and you cannot reaccess it. If the technology does not permit it, it then raises a question, well, that's different than consumers are used to in an electronic payment environment. They're used to the protections of Regulation E. Is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, for example, going to say, okay, if you're going to do that, if you're going to be involved in that kind of technology, then you need to disclose to the consumer that their rights are different with respect to this type of payment than they are if, for example, you were paying with a debit card. I don't know, did anybody else on the panel have a view of that, whether that is a likely result of the interface of a technology where the law doesn't really apply very well, and trying to find a way to get at that through concepts of unfair and deceptive practices, which is something that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in particular has been very adept at using.
Well, I could just offer one perspective. I mean, I think it is an issue, and certainly the consumer protection agencies will try to address it. On the other hand, at least again in the U.S., we've been living with a version of it for 25 years, and the republic has not fallen, which is that there is a gap, there is a difference in consumer protection for purchasing with a debit card versus a credit card. The protection, I mean, there's both on protection against unauthorized transaction, and an even starker difference in protection against buying something and then you're not satisfied with what you received. So different merchants and different banks have different practices in disclosing that difference. And at PayPal we do too. If you look into our site, there is what we call a consumer education page where we try to lay out the difference in English, and hopefully it's understandable. But that has existed, it still exists today, and it's a challenge. I think over the years, consumers, by and large, understand it. We'll see whether, the agencies think that now, with the emergence of new types of currency, now is the time to more comprehensively address the gap.
So David, why don't you talk a little bit about licensing? Because it seems to me that's going to be where some of the protection comes in, where a state says you just can't even do X, Y, or Z unless you put up some bonds and somebody has some control over you.
Right, so that is one of the other kind of big areas of kind of ambiguity at the moment, fairly well sort of unresolved as it relates to Bitcoin in terms of the nature of the licensing that does apply and registration that does apply. So we do have guidance at the federal level. FinCEN, which is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is a bureau of the U.S. Treasury, and interprets the Bank Secrecy Act and the requirements for registration of money transmitters. And FinCEN has a regulation on money transmission that requires money transmitters to be registered at the federal level if they engage in the transmission of funds or value that is a substitute for funds or currency. And it is that substitute language that has enabled FinCEN to promulgate guidance that says that Bitcoin exchanges which accept a currency in and give and stand ready to give Bitcoin back, or vice versa, redeem a Bitcoin for US dollars, are at the federal level required to be registered. So at the federal level, viewing that activity as a money transmission activity, because it's enabling the movement of value, even though it's not currency. Okay, we talk about it as virtual currency, but it's not. It is not a currency. It is a means of exchange. The IRS has issued a ruling that says that it's basically a commodity. It's not money. So at the federal level, nonetheless, we have FinCEN saying, as a Bitcoin exchanger, you need to be registered. At the state level, much more kind of wide open at this point. The state's still struggling to figure out how to regulate this activity. So we have a few states that are sort of getting out front on it. Texas has issued the most kind of complete ruling in the area to date, and has taken a pretty narrow view of their state statute, which does not have the language involving funds that substitute for currency. So what the Texas interpretation says is that a Bitcoin exchange that is involved as an intermediary between two other parties will require registration. However, if you are involved as principal in simply buying Bitcoin, selling Bitcoin, that does not require registration in the state of Texas. So it's where Texas draws the line is in this concept of intermediation, whereas at the federal level, through FinCEN, the concept is, are you holding yourself out as the party that will enable the purchase and sale of Bitcoin as an exchange? A very subtle difference between the two, and very subtle differences in the language of the statutes at the federal and state level. You have, on the other hand, a state like the state of New York, which has basically said, we're going to license this activity. We're interested in receiving applications. We're not really sure what the application should look like. We're not really sure what the license should look like, but we're going to do it. So please send us your material. Please send us your information. And a number of the other states are sort of taking a similar view. They're having a hard time fitting the activity within the specific language of a statute that says, for example, the movement of funds, because you have to then get to the point of, well, how is this code funds or a representation of funds if nobody is obligated to honor it? Okay, because that is the difference between a decentralized currency like Bitcoin and another centralized currency where somebody has said, yes, standing up, I will pay this money back. Nobody is standing behind Bitcoin. It is simply the willingness of other parties to accept it as a means of exchange. So as a best practice matter, if you are looking to be in the business of operating a Bitcoin exchange, of accepting Bitcoin and for cash or vice versa, you are going to need to look at licensing on a state-by-state basis, and that is a major task.
And if I could add, just for those who are interested in the topic, the states are actually trying to coordinate on this point. It's often one of the challenges of dealing with state licensing is you have at this point 48 different states that license non-bank money service businesses, and they don't always coordinate. They're trying to coordinate on this point through a group called the Conference of State Bank Supervisors. So if you're interested in the topic, they formed a task force. They just held the first public hearing, and will probably hold at least one more, maybe more than that. So if you're interested in the topic, search for CSBS, and you'll find the material related to this multi-state task force.
Right. There's also a related group called the Money Transmitter Regulators Association that does the same thing in terms of trying to coordinate the licensing and supervision activities for those entities that need to get licensed or are in fact licensed. So, for example, there are a number of states that are coordinating exams. PayPal is licensed in multiple states, and we'll get coordinate exams from at least some of the states. But they're also starting to coordinate with respect to application processes. So now, building off of the work that has been done in mortgage licensing with an online licensing platform, a number of the states are now participating in that for purposes of taking licensing applications for money transmission. So Florida, for example, it's a completely sort of online process now to do your registration through the NMLS, National Mortgage Licensing System.
I just wanted to make one point regarding the communicating the activity. We're talking a lot about regulating activity. I mentioned earlier when I started my piece here, it was on computational law and the role of computational law. So if you're wondering what that means, it really means taking technology and making the law more accessible. So how many of you saw the John Oliver explanation of net neutrality? Okay, so if you haven't seen it, I strongly encourage it. And the only point here is that it's an incredibly complex area that is overburdened by the fact that it is, as John Oliver has said, is incredibly dull. So most people will not bother trying to understand it because they just simply can't. The role of computational law, which is what I was thinking about the second thing I was thinking about when I saw the John Oliver piece, was that this is exactly what computational law is supposed to do, and as a matter of best practices is what people who represent the merchants and other players in the area of mobile payments should be paying attention to, is how do we make these rules in these incredibly complex processes more accessible to the everyday consumer, which goes back to the point made earlier. How do we make people trust the system that they're going to be engaging in? And we know from the statistically, many millions of people are going to be engaging in this. So one of the things that we look at in computational law, and we look at here at Codex at Stanford, is how do you use things like, we call them signaling. So you take visual cues and you communicate to consumers that they are about to enter into a very risky transaction. And of course, risky transaction is a matter of definition. So for example, what does that mean? It means that you have just entered merchant X, and we'll not name names here because this is being recorded after all. You're going to be entering into a transaction in a merchant that in the last, let's say, 3 years has had 5 breaches. How many of you would know this if you had gone into a merchant, gone to enter into a transaction at that merchant? Would that change your behavior or your decision to buy from that merchant if you had access to that information? So the signaling is visual cues that are easy to understand, that condense enormous amounts of data that we're hearing here, which is incredibly important stuff. This is what drives everything. But it takes all of this information and really condenses it into something that a consumer, an average consumer, could probably understand in less than 10 seconds. So from a best practices perspective, the question that I toss out to you is, how do you make that happen? And each person in their own environment has a different task depending on what it is that they do and who it is that they represent. But there are models out there. We write about it here at Codex, about how to do that, or there's different ways to do it, but there's a couple of ideas. And it is an evolving area that is, I think, very ripe for distinguishing amongst merchants, those who provide better consumer information very quickly, very efficiently, and are able to therefore really retain those consumers because the level of trust is just very much supported in an ongoing basis.
Well, thanks, everybody. It's, I know we're at the top of the hour and we don't want to stand between people and their lunch, so we appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.